There is a place on Earth that looks like nothing. No trees, no grass, no visible life at all. Just water, stretching endlessly toward the horizon, reflecting the sky back at itself, as if the planet had forgotten to finish this part of the world. If you were to float there, suspended in the open ocean far from any coast, you would see blue in every direction, blue above, blue below, and in between, a kind of emptiness that feels almost sacred in its silence. You might think you had found the desert of the sea, but you would be wrong, because what looks like nothing is actually everything. The open ocean, those vast stretches of water that appear lifeless and barren, are not empty at all. They are teeming, pulsing, breathing. They contain the largest living system on the planet, a biological engine so vast and so efficient that it rivals every forest, every jungle, every grassland combined. And yet you cannot see it, not with your eyes, not from a boat, not even from space most of the time. This is the paradox of the ocean. The emptier it looks, the more alive it truly is. What we're looking at when we stare out at that blue void is a kind of cosmic deception. The water itself is clear, transparent. Light passes through it easily, giving us the illusion of absence. But in every drop, in every liter, in every cubic meter of seawater, there are millions of tiny organisms, invisible to us, working ceaselessly. They are called phytoplankton, single-celled algae, microscopic drifters, the smallest and most abundant photosynthetic organisms on Earth. And they are doing something extraordinary. Every day, across the sunlit surface of the ocean, these organisms are capturing light and turning it into life. Photosynthesis, the same process that happens in every leaf on every tree, is happening here too, but at a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Phytoplankton fix approximately 50 gigatons of carbon every year, 50 billion metric tons. That's roughly equal to the carbon captured by every plant on land, every tree in the Amazon, every blade of grass in the Serengeti, every crop in every field across every continent. The ocean matches all of that with creatures you need a microscope to see. Think about that for a moment. Half of the oxygen you just breathed in came from the ocean, not from a rainforest, not from a towering redwood, but from something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that billions of them could fit in a single drop of water. This is the invisible forest, the forest that shouldn't exist, according to every instinct we have about what life looks like. But it does exist, and it is everywhere, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, in every sea and every ocean. Wherever sunlight can penetrate the surface waters, these microscopic plants are quietly fueling the entire planet. They are the base of the marine food web. Everything that swims, everything that hunts, everything that lives in the ocean ultimately depends on them. Without phytoplankton, the ocean would collapse. And without the ocean, we would follow. But their importance goes far beyond feeding fish. Phytoplankton are also doing something that might be the most important biological function on Earth. They are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it away in the deep ocean, sometimes for centuries. This is called the biological pump. It works like this. When phytoplankton photosynthesize, they absorb carbon dioxide from the water around them, just like a tree absorbs it from the air. They use that carbon to build their bodies, their cells, their tiny structures. And then, when they die, they begin to sink. Some are eaten by zooplankton, tiny animals that graze on them like invisible cattle. Those zooplankton, in turn, produce waste, fecal pellets, dense and heavy, that fall through the water like snow. And some phytoplankton simply die and drift downward, their cells still holding the carbon they captured at the surface. This is marine snow, a constant, invisible rain of organic particles falling from the sunlit upper ocean into the darkness below. Flakes of life descending slowly, feeding the creatures of the deep, carrying carbon away from the atmosphere and into the abyss. Most of this marine snow is consumed or decomposed before it reaches the bottom. Bacteria break it down. Deep-sea animals eat it. The carbon is released back into the water, where it can eventually return to the surface through ocean currents. But some of it makes it all the way down, to the seafloor, to the deepest trenches, to places where water moves so slowly that it can take 1,000 years to return to the surface. And there, that carbon stays, locked away, buried in sediment, removed from the atmospheric cycle for centuries, sometimes millennia. This is how the ocean has been regulating Earth's climate for millions of years. Quietly, invisibly, without fanfare or recognition. The biological pump is one of the planet's most important carbon sinks, and it operates continuously, day and night, across 70% of the Earth's surface. It is a global life support system, and yet we still don't fully understand it. Here's the thing scientists struggle with. They cannot predict exactly how much carbon sinks into the deep ocean. They can measure what's happening at the surface. They can estimate how much phytoplankton are producing. They can even track some of the marine snow as it falls. But the ocean is vast. It is three-dimensional. It is constantly moving, constantly changing. Currents shift, temperatures fluctuate, ecosystems respond in ways that are difficult to model. How much marine snow actually reaches the deep? How much carbon is truly sequestered? How much will remain locked away as the ocean warms and currents change? We don't know. Not precisely, not consistently, not in a way that allows us to predict the future with confidence. And that uncertainty matters. Because the ocean is changing, the water is warming, currents are shifting, and the phytoplankton, those invisible architects of the global carbon cycle, are responding in ways we're only beginning to understand. Some species are thriving, others are declining. The timing of blooms is shifting, the composition of communities is changing, and with every change in the phytoplankton, there is a change in the biological pump. A change in how much carbon is captured, a change in how much sinks, a change in the ocean's ability to regulate the climate. We are living through a moment when the invisible forest is being tested in ways it has never been tested before. And we are watching, measuring, trying to understand, knowing that what happens in these empty-looking waters will determine the future of the entire planet. This is the ocean that shouldn't exist. The ocean that looks like nothing but contains everything. The ocean that feeds us, gives us oxygen, regulates our climate, and remains even now deeply mysterious. We think we know the sea because we can sail across it, swim in it, see it from space. But the real ocean, the living ocean, the ocean that matters most, exists in a realm we cannot directly perceive. It exists in the space between seeing and understanding, and perhaps that's why we've ignored it for so long. When we think of ocean predators, we imagine teeth, rows of them, sharp and gleaming. The great white shark, breaching the surface with primal force. The orca, sleek and intelligent, hunting in coordinated packs. The barracuda, the marlin, the squid with its tentacles reaching through the darkness. These are the predators we know, the ones we fear, the ones that capture our imagination and fill our documentaries and our nightmares. But they are not the ocean's top predators, not even close. The ocean's most powerful predator is something you cannot see. Something so small that trillions of them could fit inside a single drop of water. Something that kills more living things in the ocean every single day than every shark, every whale, every hunting creature combined. They are viruses, and they are everywhere. Right now, in a single liter of seawater, there are up to 1 billion viruses, not 1 billion species. 1 billion individual viral particles, each one a microscopic package of genetic material wrapped in protein, waiting to infect. 1 billion in a liter. Think about the scale of that for a moment. The ocean contains roughly 1.35 billion cubic kilometers of water. If you were to count all the viruses in all the seas, you would arrive at a number so incomprehensibly large that it defies visualization. There are more viruses in the ocean than there are stars in the known universe, by orders of magnitude. If you could line them all up end to end, they would stretch for 200 million light years. That's farther than the distance to the nearest galaxy cluster. The viruses in our ocean, if arranged in a single file, would span a significant fraction of the observable cosmos. This is the most abundant life form on Earth, and we barely think about it. We think about whales, we think about coral reefs, we think about the charismatic megafauna, the creatures large enough to film, to study, to marvel at, from the safety of our boats. But the real action, the real power, the real story of the ocean is happening at a scale invisible to us. Every second of every day, viruses are hunting, not with teeth, not with strategy or intelligence or predatory instinct, but with something far more efficient, far more relentless. They are hunting with pure biological machinery. A virus is not alive in the traditional sense. It cannot move on its own. It cannot reproduce on its own. It cannot even metabolize energy. It is, in some definitions, just an elaborate chemical, a molecular ghost drifting through the water, waiting to find a host. And when it does, when a virus encounters the right kind of bacterium or phytoplankton cell, something extraordinary happens. It attaches. It injects its genetic material. And it hijacks the cell's machinery, turning the host into a factory for producing more viruses. Dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, all being assembled inside a single cell, using the cell's own resources, its own energy, its own molecular tools. And then, when there is no more room, when the cell is packed full of new viral particles, it bursts. This is called lysis. The cell membrane ruptures. The contents spill out into the water, and the viruses, now multiplied, drift away to find new hosts and begin the cycle again. The host cell is dead, obliterated, turned from a living, functioning organism into scattered pieces of organic matter floating in the sea. And this happens to 20 to 40% of all microbes in the ocean every single day. Let that sink in. Every day, up to 40% of the bacteria and phytoplankton in the ocean are killed by viruses, not eaten, not outcompeted, not starved or poisoned or destroyed by environmental conditions, killed by infection. It is a daily massacre on a planetary scale. If sharks killed 40% of all fish every day, there would be no fish left. The ocean would be empty within weeks. But the microbes keep reproducing, keep growing, keep dividing, fast enough to replace their losses and maintain the system. It is a balance between creation and destruction, life and death, happening continuously in every drop of seawater on Earth. But here's the thing that makes this truly fascinating. When those cells burst, when lysis occurs, the carbon and nutrients inside them don't just disappear. They don't sink to the deep ocean as marine snow. They are released into the water as dissolved organic matter, tiny molecules that other microbes can absorb directly. This is called the viral shunt. Without viruses, much of the carbon captured by phytoplankton would be eaten by larger organisms. Zooplankton would graze on the bacteria. Small fish would eat the zooplankton. Larger fish would eat them, and that carbon would move up the food chain, eventually leaving the surface waters, either by sinking when those larger organisms die, or by being consumed by something even bigger. But viruses interrupt that process. They kill the microbes before they can be eaten. They break them apart and release their contents back into the water. And that dissolved organic matter becomes fuel for other bacteria, creating what scientists call the microbial loop, a closed cycle, a recycling system. Carbon and nutrients circulating at the microscopic level, supporting an entire hidden food web that exists alongside the one we can see. It's estimated that the viral shunt redirects billions of tons of carbon every year. Carbon that would have moved up the food chain instead stays at the base, feeding the smallest organisms, maintaining the productivity of the surface ocean. Without viruses, the ocean would work differently. It would be less efficient, less productive, less diverse. Because viruses don't just kill, they also regulate. This is where things get really interesting. In any ecosystem, there is always competition. Different species vying for the same resources, the same space, the same light. In the ocean, there are thousands of species of bacteria and phytoplankton, all trying to survive in the same water. And inevitably, some are better at it than others. Some bacteria reproduce faster. Some phytoplankton are more efficient at capturing light. Some microbes have adaptations that give them an edge in specific conditions. Without any check on their growth, these winners would dominate. They would outcompete everything else, multiplying until they monopolize the resources, creating vast monocultures where diversity once thrived. But that doesn't happen because of viruses. Viruses are specialists. Each type of virus typically infects only one or a few closely related species. They have evolved to recognize specific receptors on specific cells, like a key that fits only one lock. And here's the crucial part. Viruses are most successful when their hosts are abundant. The more common a bacterial species becomes, the easier it is for viruses to find new hosts. Infections spread faster, lysis increases, and the population of that dominant species crashes. This is called kill the winner. When any microbe starts to dominate, viruses start killing it disproportionately, preventing it from taking over completely. The population drops. Other species less affected by viruses because they are less abundant get a chance to grow. Diversity is maintained. And then, if one of those other species starts to become too successful, the cycle repeats. Viruses are constantly pruning the winners, constantly preventing any single species from monopolizing the ocean. They are the ultimate equalizers, the invisible force maintaining balance in a system that would otherwise collapse into simplicity. They create diversity by destroying dominance. It's a paradox. The ocean's greatest killer is also its greatest protector. Without viruses, the ocean would be a different place, less varied, less resilient, less capable of adapting to change. They are not parasites in the traditional sense, not villains or diseases or plagues. They are architects, regulators, an integral part of the system, as essential as the phytoplankton they kill. So when we ask what the ocean's top predator is, we need to redefine what we mean by predator. Sharks kill perhaps a few dozen prey in their lifetime. A whale might consume tons of krill, but even that pales in comparison. Viruses kill trillions of organisms every single day. They shape the composition of microbial communities. They control the flow of carbon and nutrients. They maintain the diversity that allows the ocean to function. They are the apex predator of the invisible world. And the invisible world is where most of the ocean's life exists. We are so focused on what we can see, what we can film, what we can swim alongside, that we have missed the real story. The story of life and death playing out at the microscopic scale, where the rules are different, where predators don't need teeth or speed or cunning, they just need to find a host. And there are always hosts. Because the ocean is alive at every level, in every drop, in ways we are only beginning to understand. The viruses are just one part of this hidden ecosystem, one player in a complex network of interactions that sustains everything above it. But there are others, other organisms, other processes, other invisible mechanisms that keep the ocean functioning, and one of them might be the strangest of all. For most of human history, we believed we could know the world by observing it. We could collect it, catalog it, bring it into our laboratories, place it under our microscopes, and understand it. If something lived, we could grow it. study it, watch it reproduce in a petri dish, and learn its secrets. This was the foundation of microbiology, the science of the small. For over a century, we isolated bacteria from soil, from water, from our own bodies, and cultivated them in controlled environments. We fed them nutrients, we gave them optimal conditions, and we watched them grow, and from those cultures, we built our understanding of microbial life. But there was always something wrong with this picture, something that didn't quite make sense. When scientists would take a sample of seawater and look at it under a microscope, they would see thousands of cells, bacteria of different shapes and sizes, floating in the water, clearly alive, clearly active. But when they tried to grow those same bacteria in the lab, something strange would happen. Almost none of them would grow. They would try different nutrients, different temperatures, different conditions. They would attempt to recreate the ocean environment as closely as possible, and still, the vast majority of the cells they had seen would simply refuse to divide. They couldn't be cultured. At first, scientists assumed they were doing something wrong, that they hadn't found the right recipe, the right combination of factors that would coax these microbes into growing. But as the decades passed, as techniques improved, as more and more researchers tried and failed to culture most ocean bacteria, a disturbing realization began to emerge. It wasn't that we were doing something wrong. It was that these organisms couldn't be cultured at all. Not with our methods, not in our labs, not in isolation from the ocean itself. The estimate, as it stands today, is that over 99% of marine microbes cannot be grown in culture. 99%. Think about what that means. For more than a century, we have been studying only 1% of ocean microbial life, the easiest 1%. The microbes willing to grow in our artificial environments, the ones adaptable enough to survive alone in a petri dish. We built an entire understanding of the ocean's microbial ecosystem based on the tiny fraction we could actually observe in the lab, and we had no idea what the other 99% were doing. This was the great blind spot of marine biology, the invisible majority, the organisms we knew existed but could never quite reach. Scientists called it microbial dark matter, not because it was absent, but because it was undetectable by conventional means, like the dark matter of the cosmos that we know is there only by its gravitational effects. We could see the cells under the microscope, we could count them, but we couldn't identify them, couldn't study them, couldn't understand their role in the ocean. They were present but unknowable, a shadow ecosystem operating alongside everything we thought we understood. And then, at the turn of the millennium, something changed. A new technology emerged that didn't require culturing at all. It was called metagenomics, and it worked by extracting DNA directly from environmental samples. No need to isolate individual species, no need to grow them in the lab. Just take the water, filter out the cells, break them open, and sequence every fragment of DNA you find. It was like opening a book written in an unknown language and discovering that most of the pages had been hidden. What scientists found was astounding. Entire branches of life that had never been seen before. Whole groups of bacteria so different from anything we had cultured that they didn't fit into any existing classification. They called them the candidate phyla radiation. More than 70 new phyla of bacteria discovered not in some exotic environment, not in a deep-sea vent or an Antarctic lake, but in ordinary seawater. In the samples we had been collecting for decades, they had been there all along. We just hadn't been able to see them. These weren't minor variations on known species. These were fundamentally different forms of life, separated from familiar bacteria by billions of years of evolution. Lineages that had diverged before the rise of complex life on Earth, before animals, before plants, before anything we would recognize as alive, ancient, alien, operating by rules we didn't understand. And as scientists began to analyze their genomes, things got even stranger. Many of these organisms had incredibly small genomes, ultra-streamlined, missing genes that were thought to be essential for independent life. Genes for synthesizing amino acids, genes for building cell walls, genes for basic metabolic pathways that every textbook said were necessary for survival. They were gone. It was as if these bacteria had deleted everything unnecessary, stripping themselves down to the absolute minimum required to function. But how could they function without these essential genes? The answer, it turned out, was that they couldn't. Not alone. These organisms were obligate symbionts. They lived in tight-knit communities where different species provided what others lacked. One bacterium might produce an amino acid that its neighbor needed. That neighbor, in turn, might provide a vitamin or a cofactor that the first one couldn't make. They were interdependent, cooperative, relying on each other in ways that made them impossible to culture in isolation. It was a form of life we hadn't imagined, not individual organisms competing for resources, but collectives functioning as distributed networks, sharing metabolic tasks across multiple species. And these weren't rare exceptions. They were everywhere in the ocean. Potentially dominant members of microbial communities shaping the chemistry of seawater in ways we were only beginning to glimpse. Because here's the truly unsettling part. When scientists analyzed the genes these organisms did have, many of them were completely unknown. Genes that didn't match anything in any database. Genes that coded for proteins whose function could not be predicted. Metabolic pathways that didn't resemble anything we had seen before. We didn't know what they were doing. We could see that they had genes. We could sequence them. We could even predict their structure. But we couldn't tell you what they did or how they contributed to the organism's survival. It was like finding a machine with parts you've never seen before, spinning and clicking and clearly doing something important, but having no idea what that something is. And these unknown genes weren't scattered at the edges of the tree of life, in obscure lineages no one cared about. They were in abundant organisms, common ones. Microbes that were present in every ocean, contributing to fundamental processes like carbon cycling and nitrogen fixation. Processes we thought we understood, processes that underpin the entire marine food web and, by extension, life on Earth. And we realized we didn't understand them at all. Not fully, not deeply, not in the way we needed to if we wanted to predict how the ocean would respond to change. There are entire biochemical pathways happening in the ocean that we have never seen in a laboratory. Transformations of carbon and nitrogen and sulfur that don't appear in any textbook, carried out by organisms we can't culture, using mechanisms we don't comprehend. The ocean is doing chemistry we don't know about. It's a humbling thought. We pride ourselves on our scientific understanding. We map genomes, we sequence DNA, we send probes to other planets and peer into the structure of atoms. But right here, in the water that covers most of our own planet, there are fundamental biological processes that remain mysterious. And it's not because we haven't tried to understand them. It's because the organisms responsible for them exist in a state of interdependence so complex, so finely tuned, that they cannot be separated from their environment and still function. They are not individuals. They are nodes in a network, and the network is the ocean itself. This changes how we think about life in the sea. We've been trained to think of organisms as discrete units, a bacterium, a fish, a whale. Each one separate, each one capable of existing on its own, even if it depends on others for food or shelter. But in the ocean's microbial realm, that distinction breaks down. Where does one organism end and another begin when they share metabolic pathways? When one cannot survive without the other? When their genes are so intermingled through horizontal transfer that they function as a collective genome distributed across multiple cells. The ocean is not a collection of organisms. It is an organism, a planetary scale system of interconnected microbes, each one playing a role we don't fully understand, contributing to processes that regulate the chemistry of the sea and the composition of the atmosphere. And most of it is still dark to us. We have lit a few candles in this darkness. Metagenomics has revealed the existence of these hidden lineages, these unknown pathways, these ancient forms of life that have been operating invisibly for billions of years. But revealing their existence is not the same as understanding them. We know they are there now. We can read their genetic sequences. We can map their distribution across the oceans. But we still don't know what most of them do, how they interact, what ecological roles they play, how they will respond as the ocean warms, as pH drops, as currents shift, and chemistry changes. We are trying to predict the future of the ocean while being fundamentally ignorant of what most ocean life actually does. It's like trying to forecast the weather while only being able to see 1% of the clouds. And that 1% might not even be the important part. The organisms we can culture, the ones we've studied for a century, might be the exceptions, the generalists. The weeds of the microbial world, capable of surviving in unnatural conditions precisely because they are not specialized for the ocean's true complexity. The real ocean, the functional ocean, might be driven by the organisms we cannot culture, the dark matter, the invisible majority, and we are only just beginning to learn their names. But names are not enough. We need to understand what they do, how they do it, and what happens when they are disrupted. Because disruption is coming, whether we understand it or not. Light ends at 200 meters. Below that depth, the ocean becomes something else entirely. Not just darker, but fundamentally different. A world where the rules that govern the surface no longer apply. No photosynthesis here, no daily cycle of light and dark, no seasons in any meaningful sense, just pressure, cold. And darkness so complete it feels less like the absence of light and more like a presence of its own. This is the deep ocean, and it is vast beyond comprehension. The average depth of the ocean is nearly 4,000 meters, more than 2 miles down, and the deepest parts plunge to 11,000 meters, depth so extreme that the water pressure would crush almost anything that belongs to the surface world. If you were to take all the land on Earth, all the mountains and plains and valleys, and flatten them out, they would barely fill half of the deep ocean basins. This is where most of the water is, most of the space, most of the volume of the habitable world. And for a long time, we thought it was mostly dead, empty, lifeless. A cold, dark void where nothing could survive except for a few strange fish and the occasional invertebrate scavenging on scraps that fell from above. We were wrong. The deep ocean is not empty. It is teeming with life, but life that moves at a different pace, operates on a different time scale, functions by entirely different principles than anything we know from the sunlit world. This is a microbial realm, bacteria and archaea living in the water column, yes, but more importantly, living in the sediments below, in the mud and clay and ooze that covers the seafloor, in the rocks beneath that sediment, in the very crust of the earth itself. Scientists call it the deep biosphere, and it might contain as much living biomass as everything on the planet's surface combined. Think about that for a moment. All the trees, all the grass, all the animals and insects and birds, all the fish in the sea, all the microbes in the soil. There might be an equal amount of life buried beneath the ocean floor, life that most people don't know exists. The first hints of this came from deep-sea drilling projects in the 1980s. Scientists were extracting cores of sediment from the ocean floor, looking for geological data, trying to understand the history of the planet. And in those cores, even in samples from hundreds of meters below the seafloor, they found cells. At first it was assumed these were contaminants, dead cells that had fallen from the surface, artifacts of the drilling process. But the cells kept appearing, deeper and deeper, in sediments that were millions of years old, in layers of rock that should have been sterile. And some of them were alive, not active in the way we usually think of life, not growing rapidly or reproducing, but alive nonetheless, metabolizing, maintaining themselves, persisting in conditions that seemed impossible. As drilling technology improved, as scientists learned to sample deeper and keep contamination out, the picture became clearer. There is life kilometers beneath the seafloor, in sediments, in basalt, in porous rocks where seawater seeps through cracks and fissures, carrying chemistry with it. Life exists at temperatures that would cook most organisms, at pressures that would crush them, in complete darkness with no connection to the surface world except for the slow, almost imperceptible flow of water through the crust. How is this possible? The answer lies in chemistry. On the surface, almost all life ultimately depends on photosynthesis. Plants and algae capture sunlight and turn it into chemical energy. Everything else eats them, or eats something that ate them, or eats something that ate something that ate them. The energy flows from the sun through photosynthetic organisms and into the rest of the ecosystem. But in the deep biosphere, there is no sunlight, no photosynthesis, no plants. So where does the energy come from? From the Earth itself, from chemical reactions that occur when certain minerals come into contact with water, when hydrogen gas seeps out of rocks, when sulfur compounds are dissolved from volcanic deposits, when methane rises from deeper layers. These molecules carry energy, not much, not the abundant, easy energy of sunlight, but enough for microbes that have learned to be patient, to grow slowly, to extract every possible bit of energy from reactions that release only a trickle of usable power. This is called chemosynthesis, life powered by chemistry instead of light. And it has been happening beneath the ocean for as long as there has been an ocean, perhaps longer, perhaps even before photosynthesis evolved, before sunlight became the dominant energy source for life on Earth. There were microbes living in rocks, extracting energy from minerals, growing in the slow darkness of the deep. They might be the oldest form of life still surviving, the last representatives of a world that existed billions of years ago, before oxygen filled the atmosphere, before anything lived on the surface at all. And they are still here, still metabolizing, still dividing, though so slowly that a single generation might take centuries. Imagine living that slowly. Imagine existing in a state where time almost doesn't matter, where a year is like a heartbeat, where the processes of life are stretched out so thin that they become almost geological. These organisms don't experience time the way we do. They are not in a hurry. They cannot afford to be. Energy is too scarce. Every action must be measured. Every molecule of food must be used with perfect efficiency. They live at the edge of what is thermodynamically possible. Some of them have metabolism so slow that scientists initially didn't believe they were alive. The cells weren't dividing, they weren't growing in any measurable way. They were just sitting there, maintaining themselves, using barely enough energy to replace damaged proteins and keep their membranes intact. But they were alive. They are alive. Right now, beneath the seafloor, there are microbes that might live for thousands of years, maybe longer. Cells that divided during the last ice age and have not divided since. Organisms whose individual existence spans timescales we associate with civilizations, not biology. And there are trillions upon trillions of them. The deep biosphere is not a small niche. It is not a curiosity. It is a major component of the global ecosystem, a massive reservoir of life that exists in parallel to everything on the surface. Estimates of its total biomass are still uncertain, but even conservative calculations suggest something extraordinary. There might be as much as 250 billion tons of carbon locked up in the deep biosphere. That's roughly equal to all the carbon in all the plants on Earth, an entire biosphere, invisible and inaccessible, buried beneath the ocean. And it's not just sitting there, it's doing something important. The deep biosphere is part of the carbon cycle, but on a time scale so slow it's almost difficult to comprehend. When organic matter sinks from the surface, when marine snow falls through the water column and reaches the seafloor, most of it is consumed or decomposed in the upper layers of sediment. Bacteria break it down. They release the carbon back into the water as carbon dioxide, where it can eventually return to the surface through ocean circulation. But some of it is buried, covered by more sediment, more marine snow, layers accumulating over thousands, millions of years. And in those buried layers, where oxygen is gone and conditions become increasingly extreme, the deep biosphere takes over. Microbes there continue to break down organic matter, but slowly, incomprehensibly slowly, using metabolic pathways that don't require oxygen, fermentation, sulfate reduction, methanogenesis. They release methane, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, chemicals that can seep upward through the sediment or stay trapped in place, depending on the geology. And some of that carbon, a fraction of it, never comes back. It gets incorporated into minerals, locked into rock, removed from the active carbon cycle for millions of years, maybe longer, stored in the Earth's crust until tectonic forces eventually recycle it through subduction and volcanism. This is the ocean's long-term memory. The surface ocean remembers carbon for decades, maybe centuries. The deep ocean can hold onto it for millennia. But the deep biosphere, the rocks and sediments beneath the seafloor, store carbon on geological timescales. This is where carbon goes when it truly leaves the active system. And the deep biosphere mediates that process, controls how much gets stored, how much gets released, how the chemistry of the buried world evolves over time. Without the deep biosphere, the ocean would work differently. The carbon cycle would be different. The planet's long-term climate would be different. These microbes, growing so slowly they almost seem frozen in time, are part of the machinery that regulates Earth's atmosphere over millions of years. They are not responding to human activity, not adapting to current changes. They exist on a timescale so vast that the entire history of human civilization is just a flicker to them. And yet, they are connected to us. Because everything is connected, the carbon they process eventually returns to the surface through volcanism or uplift or the slow churning of tectonic plates. The methane they produce can seep upward, feeding communities of microbes and animals at the seafloor. The chemistry they create influences the composition of the ocean above. The deep biosphere is not separate from the surface world. It is the foundation beneath it. The slow breath of the planet, inhaling carbon and exhaling it back over timescales that dwarf human experience. And we have barely begun to explore it. Every time scientists drill deeper, they find life at depths they didn't expect, in temperatures they thought were too hot, in rocks they thought were too dense. Life keeps pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. How deep does it go? Is there a limit? A depth beyond which even the most resilient microbes cannot survive? We don't know yet, but every indication suggests that life goes deeper than we've looked, that the biosphere extends down into the crust, into the mantle transition zone perhaps, wherever there is water and chemistry and the faintest trickle of energy. Life, it seems, does not give up easily. It finds a way, adapts, persists in places that seem impossible. And nowhere is that more true than in the deep biosphere, where organisms live at the absolute edge of what biology allows, sustained by nothing but the chemical whispers of the earth itself. This is life in its most patient form, not striving, not competing, just enduring. And yet even this deep, even in this slow-motion world of rock and chemistry, life is not alone. For billions of years, the ocean has maintained a kind of equilibrium, not a static balance, but a dynamic one, a constant adjustment between chemistry and biology, between surface and depth, between creation and destruction. The system has survived ice ages and warm periods, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions that darkened the sky for years, mass extinctions that reset life on land. The ocean endured, not unchanged, but functional, still breathing, still cycling carbon and nutrients, still supporting life. But now, something different is happening. Something that has never happened at this speed, on this scale, in the entire history of complex life on Earth. The ocean is warming, and not gradually, not over tens of thousands of years as ice ages come and go, but over decades. In the span of a human lifetime, fast enough that we can measure it year by year, see it in the data, watch the temperature rise in real time. The average surface temperature of the ocean has increased by nearly 1 degree Celsius since the 19th century. 1 degree doesn't sound like much, but the ocean is enormous. It holds more than 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases. Warming it by even a single degree requires an almost incomprehensible amount of energy, and that heat is changing everything. Water behaves differently at different temperatures. Warm water is less dense than cold water. It floats on top, creating layers, stratification, a barrier between the surface and the deep. This has always happened. Stratification is natural. In the summer, surface waters warm and separate from deeper layers. In the winter, they cool and mix again, bringing nutrients up from below. It's a cycle, a rhythm. The ocean's breath expanding and contracting with the seasons. But as the surface warms year after year, the stratification becomes stronger, more persistent, harder to break. The barrier between surface and depth thickens, and that barrier matters more than almost anything else in the ocean, because the surface is where photosynthesis happens, where phytoplankton need light and nutrients to grow. Light comes from above, from the sun. But nutrients come from below, from the deep waters where centuries of marine snow have accumulated, decomposed, and released their nitrogen and phosphorus back into the water. Phytoplankton need both. And when the ocean stratifies, when that barrier forms, the nutrients stay trapped below. The surface becomes clearer, bluer, more beautiful to our eyes, but also poorer, less productive, less able to support life. This is already happening. In many parts of the ocean, particularly in subtropical gyres where stratification is strongest, phytoplankton productivity is declining, not collapsing, not disappearing, but slowly, measurably decreasing as the surface waters become more nutrient-starved. Less phytoplankton means less carbon captured, less food for zooplankton, less energy entering the food web, less organic matter sinking to the deep. The invisible forest is thinning, and there's more. The ocean is not just warming, it's changing chemically. About a quarter of the carbon dioxide we've released into the atmosphere has been absorbed by the ocean. The water has done us an extraordinary service, buffering the climate, slowing the rate of warming by taking in CO2 that would otherwise remain in the air. But that CO2 doesn't just disappear, it dissolves. It reacts with seawater, it forms carbonic acid, which breaks down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. And those hydrogen ions make the water more acidic. The ocean's pH has dropped by about 0.1 units since the Industrial Revolution. Again, that doesn't sound like much. But pH is a logarithmic scale. A drop of 0.1 units means a 30% increase in acidity, and it's happening faster than any ocean acidification event in the last 50 million years. Faster than most organisms can adapt. This matters for many reasons, but one of the most important involves a group of phytoplankton called coccolithophores. They are tiny, beautiful if you see them under a microscope, Each cell is surrounded by intricate plates of calcium carbonate, chalky white structures that look almost architectural in their precision. These plates serve several purposes. They protect the cell. They might help with buoyancy. And when the coccolithophore dies, those plates sink. Calcium carbonate is dense, heavy. The plates act as ballast, pulling organic matter down with them as they fall through the water column. This is crucial for the biological pump. Marine snow alone is relatively fragile. It breaks apart easily, gets eaten, decomposes. Much of it doesn't make it to the deep ocean. But when marine snow is mixed with coccolithophore plates, when it has that mineral ballast, it sinks faster, survives longer, reaches deeper waters where the carbon can be sequestered for centuries. Coccolithophores have been one of the ocean's most effective tools for exporting carbon to the deep. But in acidic water, building those calcium carbonate plates becomes harder. It takes more energy. The plates dissolve more easily. The cells are stressed, less able to compete with other phytoplankton that don't have to build shells. As the ocean acidifies, coccolithophore populations are expected to decline. We're already seeing this in some regions. Not everywhere, not uniformly. The ocean is too complex for simple patterns. But the trend is emerging. And if coccolithophores decline, if there's less ballast sinking with marine snow, the efficiency of the biological pump decreases. More carbon stays near the surface. More is remineralized before it reaches the deep. Less is sequestered. The ocean's ability to regulate atmospheric CO2 weakens. And there's something else happening too, something more subtle, harder to predict. The composition of phytoplankton communities is shifting. Different species respond differently to warming, acidification, nutrient availability. Some thrive in the new conditions, others struggle. In many parts of the ocean, there's a trend toward smaller phytoplankton. Tiny cells, ultra-small. Species like Prochlorococcus, one of the most abundant organisms on Earth, a bacterium so small that millions could fit in a single drop of water. Prochlorococcus loves warm, nutrient-poor water. It's incredibly efficient. It can photosynthesize with minimal resources. It doesn't need much nitrogen or phosphorus. In a warming, stratifying ocean, Prochlorococcus does well. But here's the problem. Larger. Phytoplankton, like diatoms and dinoflagellates, tend to produce marine snow that sinks well. They're big, dense. When they die or are eaten, they form aggregates that fall relatively quickly to depth. Smaller phytoplankton like Prochlorococcus don't sink as easily. They're too small, too light. They get caught in currents, remineralized near the surface. The carbon they capture is more likely to return to the atmosphere relatively quickly, rather than being exported to the deep. So even if total phytoplankton productivity stays roughly the same, if the community composition shifts towards smaller species, the efficiency of carbon export decreases. The ocean captures the same amount of carbon, but stores less of it. The biological pump weakens not because there's less photosynthesis, but because the photosynthesis that occurs is less effective at moving carbon to depth. This is the kind of change that's hard to see, hard to measure. It doesn't show up as dramatic collapses or obvious catastrophes. It's a quiet shift in the invisible world, a change in the rain of marine snow, in the size distribution of particles falling through the darkness, in the metabolic pathways of bacteria processing that material. Small changes that compound, and we don't know exactly how it will play out. We can measure what's happening now. We can see the trends. Warming, acidification, stratification, species shifts. But predicting the future is extraordinarily difficult because the ocean's microbial systems are so complex, so interconnected, so full of feedbacks and non-linearities that our models struggle to capture them. Will the biological pump weaken by 10%, 20%, 50%? We don't know. Different models give different answers. And those answers depend on assumptions about how microbes will respond, how ecosystems will reorganize, how the invisible processes we've spent the last 4 chapters describing will change under conditions they've never experienced before. There's another layer of uncertainty too. Everything we've discussed, warming and acidification and stratification, they don't happen in isolation. They interact. Warming changes stratification, which affects nutrient availability, which changes phytoplankton communities, which alters the types of marine snow produced, which affects how bacteria and viruses interact with that material, which influences how much carbon reaches the deep. And acidification affects not just coccolithophores, but potentially many other organisms whose roles we don't fully understand. Bacteria. Archaea. The microbial dark matter we talked about earlier, how do they respond to pH changes? Do their unknown metabolic pathways become more or less efficient? Do they outcompete other species or get displaced themselves? We don't know, because we still don't know what they do under normal conditions, let alone stressed ones. The ocean is a system of staggering complexity, and we're perturbing it in multiple ways, simultaneously while still fundamentally ignorant of how most of it works. It's like adjusting the controls on a machine we don't understand, hoping it continues to function, unable to predict when we might push something too far. Scientists talk about tipping points, thresholds beyond which the system doesn't just change gradually, but shifts into a fundamentally different state. On land, we can see these: forests that become savannas after too many droughts, ice sheets that, once they start melting, accelerate toward collapse. But in the ocean's invisible world, tipping points are harder to identify. We can't see the system well enough to know when it's approaching a critical threshold. Is stratification nearing a point where nutrient supply collapses in certain regions? Is the shift toward smaller phytoplankton reaching a stage where carbon export drops precipitously? Are microbial communities reorganizing in ways that fundamentally alter biogeochemical cycles? These questions don't have answers yet. And the uncertainty is not because scientists aren't trying. It's because the ocean is vast, sampling is difficult, and the processes we need to understand operate at scales ranging from nanometers to planetary, from seconds to centuries. But here's what we do know. The ocean has maintained a relatively stable carbon cycle for millions of years. It has responded to changes before. It has absorbed shocks. It has adapted, but never this fast. Never with the composition of the atmosphere changing in a geological instant. Never with surface temperatures rising at a rate that leaves organisms scrambling to adapt. Never with pH dropping on a timescale measured in decades rather than millennia. The ocean is resilient, but resilience has limits, and those limits exist not in the whales or the coral reefs or the fish we can see and monitor and protect. They exist in the invisible world, in the phytoplankton that capture carbon, in the bacteria that process it, in the viruses that regulate them, in the deep biosphere that stores it, in the machinery we've spent most of human history ignoring. If that machinery falters, if the biological pump weakens significantly, the consequences ripple outward. More CO2 stays in the atmosphere. Warming accelerates. Feedbacks amplify. The ocean becomes less effective at buffering the climate just when we need it most. This is the possibility we're facing. Not a certainty, not an inevitable collapse, but a risk, a growing one. And the question becomes, what can we do about it? There's a question that has haunted marine biologists for decades. A simple question, a fundamental one. What controls life in the ocean? It seems like it should have a straightforward answer. Resources are limited. Organisms compete for them. The ones that get enough nutrients grow. The ones that don't, die. Simple. Except it's not simple at all. Because when scientists look at the ocean, when they measure nutrient levels and phytoplankton populations, something strange appears in the data. In many parts of the ocean, there are plenty of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, everything phytoplankton need to grow. And yet, phytoplankton populations remain relatively stable, not exploding, not blooming into vast, uncountable numbers the way they should if nutrients were the only limiting factor. Something is holding them back. But what? This is the heart of one of the most fascinating debates in marine science. A debate about control, about causation, about which forces truly shape the ocean's ecosystems. On one side, there's the bottom-up perspective, the idea that resources control everything. If you add nutrients, you get more phytoplankton. More phytoplankton means more zooplankton. More zooplankton means more fish. And so on, up the food chain. It's a resource-driven view. The foundation supports the structure above it. Control flows from the bottom up, and there's evidence for this. When nutrients are added to the ocean, naturally or artificially, phytoplankton do bloom, sometimes spectacularly. Vast green swaths visible from space, regions where the invisible suddenly becomes visible because there's so much of it. But then there's the other side, the top-down perspective, the idea that predation controls populations, that phytoplankton don't explode not because they lack nutrients, but because they're being eaten as fast as they grow. Grazers, zooplankton, tiny animals that feed constantly, cropping the phytoplankton down, keeping populations in check, and viruses. Remember them? Killing 20 to 40% of all microbes every day, preventing any species from dominating, maintaining balance through infection rather than predation. From this view, nutrients might be abundant, but it doesn't matter because predators and viruses are regulating the system from above. Control flows from the top down. Both perspectives have merit. Both explain certain patterns in the ocean. Both are supported by observations and experiments, and both are probably right. Because the ocean is not controlled by a single force, it's controlled by interactions, feedbacks, complex relationships between nutrients and predators, between resources and mortality, between growth and death. Bottom-up and top-down forces operate simultaneously, and which one dominates depends on where you are, what season it is, what species you're looking at. The question isn't which perspective is correct. The question is, can we use this understanding to do anything about climate change? In the late 1980s, a scientist named John Martin proposed something radical. He had been studying phytoplankton growth and noticed something peculiar. In vast regions of the ocean, particularly in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica and in parts of the Pacific, there were high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus, everything phytoplankton should need. But productivity was low. Phytoplankton weren't blooming. The water was clear. The nutrients were going unused. This didn't make sense from a traditional bottom-up perspective. If nutrients were available, why weren't phytoplankton taking advantage of them? Martin had a hypothesis. Iron. Phytoplankton need iron to photosynthesize. Not much, tiny amounts. But in the open ocean, far from land, far from rivers and dust, iron is incredibly scarce. It's washed out of the atmosphere by rain before it reaches the middle of the ocean. It doesn't dissolve easily from rocks on the seafloor. There's just not much available. And without iron, phytoplankton can't grow, no matter how much nitrogen and phosphorus they have. Martin called these regions high nutrient, low chlorophyll zones, HNLC zones, places where the ocean should be productive but isn't, simply because one trace element is missing. And then he said something that would echo through the scientific community for decades. Give me a tanker full of iron and I'll give you an ice age. The idea was audacious. If you added iron to these HNLC zones, phytoplankton would bloom massively. They would capture enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and when they died, that carbon would sink to the deep ocean, sequestered for centuries. You could, in theory, cool the planet, reverse global warming, save the world with a few shiploads of iron dust. It sounded too good to be true, and in many ways it was. After Martin's death, scientists began conducting iron fertilization experiments, small ones at first. They would go to HNLC regions, dump iron into the water, and watch what happened. And phytoplankton did bloom, explosively, exactly as predicted. Within days, the water would turn green, chlorophyll concentrations would skyrocket. You could see the bloom from satellites, a bright patch of green in the otherwise blue ocean. It worked, for a while. But then scientists started measuring how much carbon actually sank to the deep ocean, and the numbers were disappointing. Most of the carbon captured by the bloom didn't reach the deep. It stayed near the surface, got eaten by zooplankton, remineralized by bacteria, returned to the atmosphere within weeks or months. The bloom was spectacular, but the carbon export was minimal. And there were other problems. When massive amounts of organic matter are produced quickly and then decay, they consume oxygen. In some experiments, the water beneath the bloom became hypoxic, low in oxygen, hostile to most marine life. Dead zones created by trying to save the climate. There were also concerns about what happens to the ecosystem when you suddenly flood it with productivity. Who benefits? Who suffers? Does the food web reorganize in unpredictable ways? And perhaps most troubling, iron fertilization could be done at scale, relatively easily, cheaply, without international oversight. It was one of the first proposed geoengineering techniques that seemed technically feasible, and that made people nervous, because geoengineering is not a solution, it's a gamble. An attempt to manipulate planetary systems we don't fully understand, hoping the benefits outweigh the unintended consequences. And as we've seen in the last 5 chapters, we really don't understand the ocean's microbial systems very well. We don't know what 99% of marine microbes do. We don't know how they'll respond to perturbations. We don't know how the invisible world will reorganize if we start deliberately manipulating it. Iron fertilization might work in some places under some conditions, but it might also fail spectacularly, create ecological disasters, shift the ocean into states we can't predict or control. It's a reminder that the ocean is not a machine we can simply adjust. It's a living system, complex, self-organizing, full of feedbacks we're only beginning to understand. And those feedbacks operate at the microbial level. This brings us back to something fundamental, something that changes how we think about ocean ecosystems. For most of the 20th century, marine biology was focused on the visible food web. Phytoplankton get eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton get eaten by small fish. Small fish get eaten by larger fish. And so on, up to the apex predators. It was a linear chain, a pyramid, energy flowing from the bottom to the top. But in the 1970s and 80s, as scientists began to study microbes more closely, they realized this classical food web was incomplete. It was missing the microbial loop. Remember what we learned about viruses? They kill microbes and turn them into dissolved organic matter. That DOM gets absorbed by bacteria. Those bacteria get eaten by tiny protists. The protists get eaten by larger zooplankton, and suddenly you're back in the classical food web. But here's the key insight. A huge amount of energy and carbon cycles through this microbial loop without ever entering the traditional food web. It circulates, gets recycled, stays at the base. The microbial loop is not a minor side process. It's not an addendum to the classical food web. It might be the dominant pathway of energy flow in the ocean. Some estimates suggest that more than half of the carbon fixed by phytoplankton goes through the microbial loop rather than up the traditional food chain. Half. This fundamentally changes how we think about ocean ecosystems. The the fish, the whales, the seabirds, the charismatic creatures we see and care about. They might not be the main story, they might be secondary, dependent on what's left over after the microbial loop has processed most of the primary production. The visible ocean might be just an afterthought of the invisible one. Think about that. Everything we've focused on, everything we've studied, everything we've tried to protect, fisheries, marine mammals, coral reefs, they all depend on a microbial foundation that we've largely ignored. And if that foundation changes, if the microbial loop reorganizes in response to warming or acidification or species shifts, the effects will cascade upward. Fish populations will change, not because we're overfishing them, though that matters too, but because the base of the food web is different. Whales will struggle not because of ship strikes or noise pollution, though those are real problems, but because the krill they eat depend on phytoplankton communities that are shifting. Seabirds will decline not because of habitat loss alone, but because the entire structure of the ecosystem they depend on is reorganizing from the bottom up, or the top down, or both simultaneously in ways we can't predict. This is the reality of trying to manage or protect ocean ecosystems. We're operating at the wrong scale. We're trying to protect the visible while the invisible changes beneath us. And the invisible is what actually runs the ocean: the microbes, the viruses, the dissolved organic matter, the bacterial communities, the archaea, the microbial dark matter. They determine how much carbon is captured, how efficiently it's exported, how quickly it's remineralized, how the chemistry of the water evolves. The large organisms, the ones we care about, the ones we can see, they are passengers in a system controlled by forces they can barely influence. And we are passengers too. We depend on the ocean for oxygen, for climate regulation, for food, for the basic habitability of the planet. And the ocean depends on microbes. If we want to understand what will happen as the climate changes, we need to understand the invisible world. If we want to predict how ecosystems will respond, we need to understand microbial processes. If we want to know whether the ocean can continue buffering atmospheric CO2, we need to understand the biological pump at the microbial level. And if we're ever foolish enough to try geoengineering to deliberately manipulate ocean productivity, we need to understand the consequences for the microbial systems that truly control everything. Otherwise, we're just guessing, hoping, trusting that the ocean will continue to function the way it always has, even as we change every variable that determines how it works. It's not a comforting position to be in, but it's where we are. And perhaps that's why the invisible ocean matters so much. Not just because it's fascinating, though it is. Not just because it's the largest ecosystem on Earth, though it is. But because our future depends on it. There is a kind of irony in what we've discovered about the ocean. The smallest forms of life have the largest impact. Single-celled organisms, invisible to the naked eye, control the composition of the atmosphere. Viruses, not even truly alive by most definitions, regulate entire ecosystems. Bacteria buried kilometers beneath the seafloor store carbon for millions of years. The beings we can see, the ones we name and protect and study, they are important, yes. But they are not fundamental. They are emergent properties of a microbial world. This challenges something deep in how we think about life. We are trained to see organisms as individuals, discrete beings, bounded by skin or cell membranes or shells, each one separate from the others, competing, surviving, reproducing on its own terms. This is how we understand ourselves, as individuals, autonomous, independent. But the ocean tells a different story. In the 1970s, a scientist named James Lovelock proposed something controversial, something that bordered on philosophy as much as science. He called it the Gaia hypothesis. The idea was that Earth itself functions as a kind of living system, not metaphorically, not poetically, but functionally, that the planet's chemistry, its temperature, its atmospheric composition are all regulated by life in ways that maintain conditions suitable for life to continue. It's a feedback system, a self-regulating one. Life modifies the environment shapes life, and together they create a stability that has persisted for billions of years. When Lovelock first proposed this, many scientists were skeptical. It sounded too mystical, too much like attributing intention or purpose to the planet, as if Earth were a conscious being deliberately maintaining itself. But Lovelock wasn't suggesting consciousness. He was suggesting regulation, homeostasis, the same kind of feedback mechanisms that keep your body temperature stable or your blood pH balanced, operating at a planetary scale. And the more we've learned about how Earth works, the harder it is to dismiss. Consider oxygen. 21% of the atmosphere is oxygen. That's a very specific number, high enough to support complex life like us, but not so high that forests spontaneously combust every time there's a spark. Why 21%? Why not 15 or 30 or some other arbitrary value? Because oxygen levels are regulated by life. Phytoplankton and plants produce oxygen through photosynthesis. Bacteria and fungi consume it through respiration and decomposition. Fires consume it. Rocks weather and absorb it. And somehow, despite all these sources and sinks operating independently, oxygen has remained relatively stable for hundreds of millions of years. That's not random. That's not coincidence. That's a system maintaining itself. And at the heart of that system are microbes. Microbes in the ocean producing half the oxygen. Microbes in the soil cycling nutrients. Microbes in the deep biosphere storing carbon. Microbes everywhere. Billions upon billions of species, each one playing a small role in maintaining the chemistry of the planet. Individually, they are insignificant. A single bacterium does almost nothing. But collectively, they are everything. They are the planetary immune system, the recycling mechanism, the regulatory network that keeps Earth habitable. Without them, the atmosphere would be unbreathable, the oceans would be sterile, the land would be barren rock. Life on Earth is not a collection of organisms happening to coexist. It is a system, an integrated whole, with microbes as the foundation, the connective tissue, the invisible machinery that makes everything else possible. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the ocean. We talked earlier about the microbial loop, about how carbon and energy cycle through bacterial communities, getting recycled, reprocessed, transformed. But there's something else happening in those communities, something even more fundamental: genetic exchange. Bacteria don't just reproduce by dividing, they also share genes, directly, horizontally. A bacterium can pick up a piece of DNA from the water, integrate it into its own genome, and suddenly gain new abilities: resistance to antibiotics, the capacity to metabolize a new chemical, a different metabolic pathway. This is called horizontal gene transfer, and it happens constantly in the ocean. Viruses facilitate it. When a virus infects a cell, sometimes it accidentally packages a bit of the host's DNA along with its own genetic material. Then it carries that DNA to the next host, transferring genes between organisms that might not even be closely related. Bacteria also exchange DNA through direct contact, through pili, little bridges that connect cells and allow genetic material to flow from one to the other. And sometimes bacteria just absorb naked DNA floating in the water, remnants of dead cells, fragments released by lysis, genetic material that's no longer part of any organism but still functional, still able to be incorporated. The ocean is swimming in genes, free-floating, moving between organisms, blurring the boundaries of what it means to be an individual. Where does one bacterium end and another begin if they share genes, if they exchange metabolic capabilities, if their genomes are porous, constantly being updated with information from the surrounding community? In the ocean, Individuality breaks down. There are no truly isolated organisms, no bacteria living entirely on its own genetic legacy. Every microbe is part of a genetic commons, a shared pool of information that circulates through the community. Scientists sometimes call this the ocean's metagenome. Not the genome of any single organism, but the collective genetic information of the entire microbial community. All the genes, all the metabolic pathways, all the capabilities distributed across trillions of cells, but functionally integrated. It's like the ocean has one shared genome in motion, constantly reorganizing, constantly being edited. Genes moving from cell to cell as conditions change, as selective pressures shift, as new challenges arise. This is evolution, but not in the way Darwin described it. Not gradual change over generations through random mutation and selection, but rapid adaptation through sharing, through cooperation, through a kind of distributed intelligence where the community as a whole can respond to environmental changes faster than any individual species could evolve on its own. If a new chemical appears in the water, if a toxin is introduced, there might already be a gene somewhere in the community that can metabolize it, and through horizontal transfer, that gene can spread rapidly, allowing many species to acquire the ability within days or weeks. The ocean adapts as a collective, and this raises a profound question. What is the ocean really? Is it a habitat, a place where organisms live, or is it, in some meaningful sense, an organism itself, a planetary-scale entity with microbes as its cells, ocean currents as its circulation, chemical gradients as its signals, and the carbon cycle as its metabolism? It processes energy, it responds to changes, it maintains homeostasis through feedback mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. It even has a kind of memory, encoded not in neurons, but in sediments, in the deep biosphere, in the genetic diversity of its microbial communities. This is not a metaphor. This is a functional description of how the ocean works. And if the ocean is an organism, then so is Earth. Not a conscious being, not intelligent in any way we would recognize, but living, integrated, self-regulating, with the invisible microbial world as its foundation, the circulatory system carrying nutrients and gases, the immune system controlling populations through viral predation, the metabolic system transforming energy and matter, the genetic system storing and distributing information, all of it operating at scales from nanometers to planetary, from seconds to geological epochs, all of it invisible to us, yet more essential than anything we can see. This perspective, this way of understanding life, it changes everything. It means the ocean is not a resource to be exploited or a wilderness to be preserved. It is part of a living planet, part of us, part of the system that created us and continues to sustain us. When we change the ocean's chemistry, when we warm its waters, when we disrupt its microbial communities, we are not harming something external. We are disrupting the regulatory systems of the planet itself, the systems that maintain oxygen levels, that sequester carbon, that recycle nutrients, that keep Earth habitable. We are interfering with processes that have been operating for billions of years, long before we existed, and will continue long after we're gone, assuming we don't break them irreparably. And that's the question, isn't it? How much can we disrupt before the system fails to regulate itself? Before the feedbacks break down? Before the invisible machinery that runs the ocean stops functioning the way it has for eons? We don't know, because we're still discovering what that machinery is, still mapping the microbial dark matter, still understanding the metabolic pathways, still learning which genes do what and how communities reorganize under stress. We're trying to predict the behavior of a planetary organism whose cells we can't culture and whose genetics we've only begun to sequence. It's humbling, deeply humbling, to realize that the smallest forms of life have shaped the entire planet, That invisible bacteria have more influence over Earth's climate than all the animals combined. That viruses, drifting mindlessly through the water, maintain the diversity that allows ecosystems to function. We think of ourselves as powerful. We've split atoms. We've walked on the moon. We've sequenced our own genome and begun to edit it. But we did not create the oxygen we breathe. We do not regulate the carbon cycle. We do not maintain the chemistry of the ocean. Microbes do. They always have. And if we're to have any hope of navigating the changes we've set in motion, we need to understand that we are not above this system. We are within it, part of it. Dependent on invisible processes operating at scales we can barely perceive, let alone control. The ocean that looks like nothing is everything. It is the planet's true circulatory system, moving not just water, but information, energy, genes, life itself around the globe. It connects the surface to the deep, the present to the geological past, the living to the chemical, the individual to the collective. It is the medium through which Earth regulates itself, and we are only now beginning to see it clearly, to recognize that the visible ocean, the one we film and sail across and swim in, is just the surface expression of something far deeper, far older, far more essential. The invisible ocean beneath it, the microbial ocean, the ocean that thinks not with neurons or consciousness, but with chemistry and genes and the slow, patient feedback of billions of years of evolution. The ocean that is, in a very real sense, alive. And so, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to be part of a living planet? We began with emptiness, with blue water stretching endlessly toward the horizon, with a silence so profound it felt like absence itself, the open ocean, the place that looks like nothing. And we asked, what could possibly live there? Now, after descending through layers of understanding, after witnessing invisible forests and viral predators, after exploring microbial dark matter and the deep biosphere, after contemplating the ocean as a living system that thinks in chemistry and time, we return to that question. But we see it differently now. The emptiness was never empty. The silence was never silent. The nothing was always everything. It's a strange kind of blindness we suffer from, isn't it? We can see galaxies billions of light years away. We can detect gravitational waves from colliding black holes. We can image individual atoms with electron microscopes. But we cannot see the life that surrounds us in every drop of seawater. We cannot perceive the phytoplankton capturing half the world's carbon. We cannot witness the viruses maintaining balance through daily massacre. We cannot observe the bacteria cycling nutrients, the archaea processing chemicals, the deep biosphere storing carbon for geological ages. We are surrounded by the greatest living system on Earth, and we walk past it every time we visit the beach. We sail over it, we swim through it, we depend on it for every breath, and we see nothing. This is not a failure of our eyes. It's a failure of our imagination. We have been trained to value what we can see, to protect what is large and charismatic, to care about whales and dolphins and coral reefs, and those things matter. They do. But they are not the foundation. They are not the system that makes life on this planet possible. That system is invisible. It has no face, no form, no individual we can point to and say, this matters, save this. It is a collective, a process, a planetary metabolism operating at scales both infinitesimally small and incomprehensibly vast. And it has been working ceaselessly for billions of years. Long before there were forests on land, there was the invisible ocean. Long before there were animals, there were microbes in the sea, capturing sunlight, producing oxygen, transforming a toxic atmosphere into one that could support complex life. We are their descendants, their creation, the products of billions of years of microbial engineering. Every oxygen molecule you breathe was produced by photosynthesis, half of it by phytoplankton in the ocean, the other half by plants on land, which themselves evolved from ocean-dwelling algae. Without the invisible ocean, there would be no breathable air. Without bacteria and archaea cycling nitrogen and phosphorus, there would be no nutrients to build proteins and DNA. Without the biological pumps sequestering carbon in the deep, Earth's climate would be wildly unstable, too hot for most life as we know it. Without viruses regulating microbial populations, ecosystems would collapse into simplicity. Without the deep biosphere storing carbon for geological timescales, the planet's long-term climate regulation would fail. The invisible ocean does all of this, not because it wants to, not because it has purpose or intention, but because that's what life does. It transforms, it processes, it creates conditions that allow more life to exist. And in doing so, it regulates the planet. This is what James Lovelock saw, what the Gaia hypothesis tried to articulate. Earth is not a dead rock with life clinging to its surface. It is a living system, integrated, self-regulating, with microbes as the foundation of that regulation. And the ocean, the vast invisible ocean, is the heart of that system. It is the planetary circulatory system moving nutrients, gases, energy, genetic information around the globe. It connects the atmosphere to the deep, the sunlit surface to the buried sediments, the present moment to geological deep time. It is the interface between the living and the non-living, the place where chemistry becomes biology and biology becomes chemistry, where the boundaries blur and dissolve until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. This is what we mean when we say the ocean is alive. Not that it has consciousness, not that it thinks or feels or perceives, but that it functions as an integrated whole, that its parts work together in ways that maintain conditions suitable for life, that it responds to perturbations, that it adapts, that it has memory encoded in genes and sediments and the distribution of species. It is alive in the same way a cell is alive. A collection of processes, each one simple, but together creating something emergent, something greater than the sum of its parts. And we are part of it, not separate observers looking at the ocean from outside, but participants, components, cells in a planetary organism that we're only now beginning to recognize. When we breathe, we are breathing the ocean's gift. The oxygen produced by phytoplankton and cyanobacteria over billions of years. When we eat, we are consuming energy that flowed through ocean food webs or through terrestrial systems that depend on nutrients cycled by microbes. When we exist, we are participating in a system that was built by the invisible world and continues to be maintained by it. This should change how we think about our relationship with the ocean. It's not a resource, not a wilderness, not a backdrop for human activity. It is the life support system of the planet, the foundation of everything else. The reason Earth is habitable at all. And we are disrupting it, not deliberately, not with malice, but with ignorance, with the assumption that something so vast could absorb any amount of change, that something invisible could be ignored. We are warming the water, changing its chemistry, disrupting the stratification that brings nutrients to the surface, shifting the composition of microbial communities, weakening the biological pump. And we're doing all of this while still fundamentally ignorant of how the system works. We don't know what most ocean microbes do. We don't know how they'll respond to the changes we're causing. We don't know where the tipping points are or what happens if we cross them. We're conducting an experiment on the planetary life support system without understanding the organism we're experimenting on. It's terrifying when you think about it clearly. But perhaps there's something else we should feel alongside that terror: awe. Because what we've discovered about the invisible ocean is genuinely wondrous. The elegance of the viral shunt, the patience of the deep biosphere, the cooperative complexity of microbial dark matter, the way genes flow through communities like information through a network, the fact that the smallest forms of life have the largest impact. This is not a story of scarcity or limitation, it's a story of abundance, of life finding ways to exist in every corner of the ocean, from the sunlit surface to the crushing darkness of the deep, from freezing polar waters to hydrothermal vents, from open water to kilometers beneath the seafloor. Life is everywhere we look once we learn to look at the right scale. And it's not just surviving, it's thriving, diversifying, innovating, creating complexity from simplicity, organization from chaos. The invisible ocean is a testament to what life can do when given enough time and space. And time is what we're running out of, not the ocean's time. The ocean will persist. Life will adapt. Microbes will continue to cycle nutrients and produce oxygen and regulate chemistry, even if everything above them collapses. They survived asteroid impacts. They survived mass extinctions. They survived the complete freezing of the ocean during snowball Earth events. They will survive us. But will we survive the changes we're causing? Will we survive in a world where the biological pump weakens, where stratification increases, where the composition of phytoplankton shifts toward species that export less carbon, where the microbial communities that maintain atmospheric oxygen reorganize in ways we can't predict? That's the real question, not whether the ocean will survive, but whether the ocean will continue to provide the services we depend on, the oxygen, the climate regulation, the carbon sequestration, the foundation of food webs that feed billions of people. And the answer depends on what we do next, on whether we continue to treat the ocean as invisible, as something that will always be there, always functioning, always supporting us no matter how much we change it, or whether we start to see it for what it truly is, the greatest living system on Earth, the foundation of everything else, the planetary circulatory system without which nothing else matters. We need to see the invisible ocean, not with our eyes. We'll never see it that way. But with our understanding, our imagination, our recognition that the most important things are often the ones we cannot perceive directly. We need to fund the science that maps microbial diversity, that sequences metagenomes, that tracks how communities respond to environmental change. We need to monitor the biological pump, to measure carbon export, to understand where and how and why it's changing. We need to protect the ocean, not just by creating marine reserves or limiting fishing, though those things help, but by reducing the emissions that warm and acidify the water, by slowing the rate of change so the invisible world has time to adapt. We need to recognize that saving the ocean means saving the microbes, the viruses, the bacteria, the archaea, the invisible foundation that makes everything else possible. This is not the conservation we're used to. There are no charismatic species to rally around, no beautiful animals to feature in fundraising campaigns, just invisible life, doing invisible work, operating at scales we can barely comprehend. But that work is everything. It builds the air we breathe, it cools the planet, it recycles the world we live on. It maintains the chemistry that allows complex life to exist. The invisible ocean is not peripheral. It is central. It is not a detail. It is the story. And if there's one thing to take from this journey through emptiness that revealed abundance, through darkness that contained light, through silence that hummed with activity, it's this. The nothing we see when we look at the open ocean is not nothing at all. It is the planet's everything, the system that made us, that sustains us, that will continue long after we're gone, carrying forward the ancient project of life, the slow, patient work of transforming chemistry into biology and biology back into chemistry, the endless cycle that has kept Earth alive for 4 billion years. And it asks nothing from us in return. It doesn't need our recognition or gratitude. It doesn't require our understanding. It simply is, working, breathing, processing, living. In every drop of water, in every particle of marine snow, in every virus drifting through the darkness, in every bacterium buried beneath the seafloor. The greatest life on Earth has no face, no form, no fame. It is the ocean's nothing and the planet's everything.